Hello everyone, today we talk about Andrea Fortebracci, known as Braccio da Montone, one of the most famous Italian condottieri. This is the first video I make about the military biography of a specific character, alongside the new genre of properly biographical content focusing on single characters that I decided to introduce mostly as specials on Schwerpunkt, next to our habitual content that won't be, lost, of course, in the process, and that, on the contrary, will perfectly blend into this new one, will perfectly integrate with this addition. And the main difference between a biography and military biography, as you can readily understand, is that while there are some characters, like in this case Braccio da Montone, that really deserve to be considered in a broader sort of political and also all-round biographical sense, it's important, in my opinion, not just as a military historian, to focus on the strategic dimensions of these guys' accomplishments. What did it mean for example, Braccio da Montone to be one of the most famous, important, and effective condottieri out there? It's also a time and place that we haven't really quite covered. I think that especially the 14th, the 15th century, when it comes to Germany, Italy, we haven't really covered in great, especially military historical detail. We have made, for example, for Italy, lots of videos about communal warfare that is actually underrated and even more important, telling the truth, than the condottieri one, especially in the in-between phase of the late 13th, first half of the 14th century. And then, of course, people born like Andrea Fortebracci in the second half of the 14th century were partially tied to, but it really had distanced themselves from it in the ways of war. And there is a level of political fragmentation. Braccio da Montone lived between 1368 and 1424. So he actually lived long enough to witness an important degree of political recompaction in Italy, but he also moved his first steps as a condottiere in one of the most turbulent and de facto chaotic moments in peninsular history. I recently made a video about the medieval free companies that mostly involve France during, after the Bretigny Treaty. We will focus on, of course, a great biography here on the list is John Hawkwood, that we have separated so far from anybody else, even in the free companies chapters, because he's such a big deal that he deserves, together with his White Company, really a chapter on his own. But this encompasses other figures, such as, just to stick to the foreigners, I don't know, the Count of Landau, for example, the Bretons, right? There is really in a very specific dimension of the Italian free companies that will, however, be supplanted from the 70s and the 80s virtually entirely by Italians, right? By national Italian leaders. And Braccio da Montone is one of the greatest figures around, founder of, at least allegedly, of a specific military school. Perhaps too much has been written about that. If anything, I will make an entire video on this, because actually the ways these guys would fight was relatively homogeneous. There could be some styles, some sort of different temper, the various commanders, but we're not culturalists, we are Clausewitzians. We study things on the basis of their strategic logic that these men definitely had a very consistent level. So let's dig into this, which may at some point sound even astonishing for all the local mentions of especially central Italian cities that Braccio da Montone at some point came to fight in, rule over, being himself, as we will see now, a native Umbrian. And I made a video about medieval Perugia, in the contado of which he was born, as we will see now. And it may seem like a local history, but it's important also to grasp, in a strategic sense, probably the territorial dimension of these campaigns, and appreciating the history of these places that in general, for how much the condottieri can be known as a name, that nobody really seems to really discuss on YouTube. So I think that this video can't really be helpful. At some point, we'll make, of course, other videos, including maybe a fuller biography of Braccio da Montone, whose existence was, however, de facto spent virtually entirely fighting. So probably for him, at least in this format, it will not be necessary to dub. But there are so many other different aspects of his warfare that we'll discuss in many other videos. Andrea Fortebracci was born on July the 1st, 1368, in Perugia's Porta Sant'Angelo district, or possibly at the castle of Montone, a lordship held by his family until 1280. Right, the Montone is the mutton that you can see also in his coat of arms. Born to Oddo Fortebraccio. Fortebraccio means strong arm. All right, so simply strong arms. It would be the English translation. Count of Montone and captain of the people in Florence, interestingly enough, in 1372-73. So when Braccio was, when Andrea, because as we'll see now, like Braccio was a nickname, of course, gained after his early military exploit, was like 4 or 5. This is important because we recently concluded the regional historical series about Florence that illustrates the quite relevant, not just centrality of the city in the Tuscan, and also in great part of the international banking reality, but also its sort of turbulent popular institutions. The captain of the people in Florence was someone provided with some significant military experience. There were many, so it's not like here it was a uniquely sort of bestowed office, but it surely stemmed from this warlikeness. And there is a very important dynamic here, which we will see better perhaps when talking about the Montefeltro, is to say the Apenninic nobility is one of the single most warlike, if not probably the most warlike in the peninsula. These guys from the mountainous hinterland often sold their services as some of the finest commanders, coming from pretty isolated castles. In fact, in these enchanted scenarios, in the service, however, the greatest Italian powers in the lower lands. Right, there are countless examples. Braccio can be included together with them. Also considering that Perugia was part of the Papal States, unlike Florence. This is yet another aspect. The Papal States historically had, and Braccio is one of the best examples of this, by far the finest military commanders in all the peninsula, right? Regardless of, or even perhaps thanks to, this level of relative political, especially administrative fragmentation, the persistence of some sort of more military feudal lifestyle, so the imperfection of the Papal States, in fact we call plural as a sum of different territories that at some point the Pope had quite some difficulty to properly control, really provided the most warlike and effective condottieri in this period, in the later Middle Ages, in the Renaissance. And had the Papal States been sort of politically united, ideally, surely this region would have basically hegemonized the Italian peninsula. The mother of Braccio was Giacomo Montemellini, who encouraged her son's military inclinations. Andrea was the youngest son, by the way, following brothers Carlo and Giovanni, with sisters Stella Monalduccia and Giovanna, though their birth order remains actually uncertain. The Fortebracci maintained allodial properties and prominence in the region despite losing Montone, as we've seen early on. There were some Umbrian lords gravitating around Perugia. In 1378, at age 10, Andrea was exiled from the same Perugia with other nobles due to the victory of the popular faction. Here we don't provide too much extra info because there is already enough the way the video is made. But of course, there were habitually some two major factions in the cities that were backed by different popular and nobiliar groups. At this point, the Fortebracci were from the losing side, and this marked the beginning of a tumultuous life for Braccio, shaped by exile and warfare. In fact, most of his life will essentially revolve around, almost Freudianly, coming always back to his native Montone, Perugia, and at some point managing even to control them after much strife. Andrea's military career began early, just for a man of his rank, of his extraction. By 1385 or 86, at 17 or 18, he in fact served as a page in Guido d'Ascanio's company in Apulia, in southern Italy, later joining Alberico da Barbiano's company of St. George, which was one of the most famous at the time, and where Braccio met his future rival and sometime ally, Muzio Tendolo Sforza, clashing initially over spoils, but forming a friendship. In fact, the Sforzeschi and Bracceschi historically will be as we were saying before, this ideal schools of military thought among the condottieri. Sforza more sort of reserve-based, Braccio more aggressive, more direct. But again, there is a degree of mythology behind this that at some point it will be able, we will hopefully be able to criticize in a separated video. In 1388, though some sources suggest different dates, such as 83, 95, because again, you don't simply track, even in some of the best documented areas of Europe, largely, especially the beginnings of these condottieri can be relatively foggy when they were not that famous yet. In any case, at this point, Braccio served under Barbiano, as we've seen, alongside Sforza as well, around this time leading 15 horsemen under Antonio da Montefeltro. This is a squad, basically. The Montefeltro were yet perhaps the most famous of these Apenninic clans in terms of military prestige. Andrea raided Fossombroni's territory controlled by the Malatesta, a Romagnol signory. Everything, again, is complicated. We often haven't discussed these houses, which I'm going to do instead, exactly to provide with greater clarity, because Italian political fragmentation, from one side, sort of hampers the efforts of sort of more unitary history at some point, but it also underscores a greater compaction, especially in social, cultural, and political military terms, than that it's all often believed. And in fact, these kind of this condottieri's lifestyle was a quite unifying factor, one from which also more advanced military systems advanced later. During one such raids between 1391 and 1392, Braccio was ambushed, wounded in the chest and neck, captured, and ransomed for 2,000 ducats. That is roughly the equivalent of florins as well. In another skirmish, Braccio suffered a severe head injury, causing temporary right side hemiplegia and leaving slight numbness in his left leg, though rehabilitation mitigated the condition. At some point, I actually would like to start a series on military medicine, but there is probably a field of study of some, historical, archaeopathological research that is incredibly promising. That is to say, how did a veteran of 14th century warfare actually look like? We have terrible things like everybody has seen the perforated skulls of the Visby. There's plenty of all this stuff, but sometimes you realize that this man spent, in fact, their entire life on horseback, and they received hundreds, if not thousands, of wounds. And what would they have actually looked like? And how, especially, even more interestingly, how was their mind impacted? This is something that today we don't have much time to digress on, but it's still a huge deal. Just think about what it meant to be born and live and fight in such world, such environment. The recurring Montefeltro-Malatesta conflicts and independent sources lend credibility to all these events, by the way. They could be considered not necessarily legendary, but anecdotal, right? Because lots of stories would eventually develop around, as we'll see, one of the greatest warlords of his time. What, if anything, remains uncertain is, next to their plausibility, is the precise timing and location in the central Italian struggles. In 1390, spurred by his brothers, Andrea quelled a revolt in Montone against part of their same, perhaps part of the same clan, because this also happened at a point with this extended military groups, or more likely, however, against Perugia's noble-led Beccarini government, awakened by the advancing Raspanti faction led by Biordo Michelotti, that, as we will see now, will recur as a sworn enemy of Braccio. Again, I have made a video about medieval Perugia, so if you're interested specifically in the history of the city and what was going on in general in the international scenario with its neighbors, its various wars, various regimes, you can check that out. Braccio stormed Montone with a small force, killing 2 or 3 opponents in the town square, and another upon returning from Perugia, an act that earned him the nickname Braccio. From his family, and a bounty from Città di Castello, is another Umbrian city, after he led locals to kill one of its citizens. To avoid reprisal, Braccio fled, forming a company of 15 men-at-arms, that's the one mentioned before, to serve the Montefeltro against the Malatesta. In July 1393, the Raspanti, mediated by Pope Boniface IX, re-entered Perugia, expelled the nobles, and forced the Pope to flee. Andrea, with other exiles, then retreated to Montone and attempted to reach Fratta Todina, now Umbertide, to prevent its submission to the new regime. Ambushed and captured, he was imprisoned in Fratta's fortress, but freed by Biordo Michelotti, that at least at that time was seeking an agreement with the Fortebracci clan. In November 1393, Perugia's government temporarily entrusted Montone to the 3 Fortebracci brothers, exempting them from taxes. This was a tactical move. In fact, Andrea opposed the Raspanti, signing a secret pact on December the 1st of 1394 against negotiating with them. In the spring of 1395, Perugia sent an armed garrison to the castle of Montone to curb rebellion incited by Braccio's followers. This is really typical. We've seen it many times in the history of Italian communes. The commune tries to subjugate all the various hundreds of castles in these basically hundreds of square kilometers around the city-states that were quite, as you know, thick in the dense urban net of medieval Italy, and is still basically the modern patterns are based on. And on May the 25th, Biordo and the priors of the arts ordered Andrea and Giovanni to reside in Perugia without leaving, without permission. So de facto they were taken as hostages. The next day, Michelotti allocated confiscated rebel properties to Carlo and Giovanni, excluding Andrea, who had refused to serve him in the process. In 1392, Andrea married Elisabetta Armanni, who died in 1419 without issue. That year, a temporary defeat of the Popolani, of the popular faction, allowed Braccio a brief return to Perugia with other nobles. By April 1395, he rejoined Barbiano's service in Naples, fighting the anti-pope in Lazio with 12 lances under his command. There was all a specific eater, these military clans, based on age and experience. Like, I give you ever more troops to lead, and you rise to the ranks accordingly. In 1396, Braccio supported Perugia's noble exiles against the Raspanti as well. It's always a very, again, conflictual scenario. You understand how he goes fighting in other Italian regions, but he maintains, of course, connections with his home, where also an important part of his assets laid. And again, the struggle between the commune and the surrounding castles, right, held by different factions that, as we've seen in this case, were rebel or not, even though they lived in the city in part as well, is quite typical of the picture. I made many videos about the communes and their military relation with the contado, that especially at this point basically wins, or at least the sort of various noble families of the city tend to hegemonize the latter also through their rural possessions. In May 1397, with 30 lances, Braccio joined Crasso da Venosa and Bindo da Montopoli, hired by Florence to deter Gian Galeazzo Visconti's attack. In February 1398, he hated papal forces under Malatesta, yeah, they called them like that, just the same name of the clan, and Bartolomeo da Pietramala, besieging Montone and raiding Città di Castello and Perugian territories. This is interesting for so many reasons intertwined, aside from the fact that he served some other condottieri in the clashes between Florence and Milan, but the fact that he, in this sense, was even aiding the papal government to recover control on his own native territories, to eventually being, invested by some control over the same, at least in expectation. After Biordo Michelotti's assassination in March 1398, Andrea with Bartolomeo Oddi and other exiles intensified efforts to seize Perugia's castles in the countryside, occupying Montemelino and Vico's castle, and devastating Assisi's countryside with Ceccolo Broglia in a failed attempt to capture the city as well, and the city of St. Francis. On January the 20th, 1400, Perugia's Raspanti faction dedicated the city to the Visconti of Milan to block the nobles' return. This was historically done, especially by the cities living pretty far from, in this case, Milan, to say, and even more gladly, to say, okay, we'll get some kind of protection because we sworn sort of allegiance to them, so they must send us some military help of sorts, some condottiero, and that's how most of things unfolded. But at the umpteenth sort of dynastic clash among the Visconti themselves, like things would often return just how they were, right? It's not like Milan ever had a very strong possibility to control the very heart of the central Italian Apennine heartland, like in this case. So at this point, Andrea, you see, he was always trying to come back home, right, and to reinstate himself, his rights, his seigneury, and he was multiple times frustrated in it. Andrea roamed thus the peninsula, fighting under Mostarda da Forlì for the papacy against the Visconti in 1402. It would be interesting to give a minimal background about all these various condottieri. There were really many, some of which are also really forgotten in history, but it's interesting to think where they came from in particular. And so this locating all the various locations across the peninsula. After, and also the political allegiances, because naturally these were mostly men starting to be, if anything, from specific areas under specific clans' inclinations, not necessarily always from the same side. As we've seen, there was even some infighting among their groups. In any case, after Gian Galeazzo Visconti's death on September the 3rd, 1402, Braccio joined papal forces under Giovanni Tomacelli, the Pope's brother, alongside Paolo Orsini, Mostarda da Forlì, and Conte da Carrara, raiding Perusian territory once again. In January 1403, he was defeated near Assisi by Ottobono III's 2,500 cavalry after a 3-hour battle, but regrouped for further raids. That summer, he besieged Assisi's fortresses, preventing Visconti relief, defeated opponents at Pieve Caina, captured over 50 castles, and threatened Perugia, defended only by Ceccolino Michelotti. The Michelotti clan, again, was keeping its hostility against Braccio. A peace between Boniface IX and Caterina Visconti allowed papal forces to enter Perugia, where on November the 20th, 1404, though exiles were barred from returning or approaching within 20 miles, because essentially the same papal government feared the coups from the same condottieri that, as we've seen, had basically supported their action of reclamation of the papal possessions. So, feeling betrayed by the Pope, Andrea sought employment in Florence and in the same Rome without success before rejoining Barbiano in Romagna with 12 horsemen. It's also another retinue. We're talking small units, but these were part of the bigger forces. And it's typical, like, of the general sort of company's organization. We also talked about this in other videos. In 1404, Braccio fought for Florence against Milan in Lombardy, aiding Ugolino Cavalcabò in Lodi, and supporting Cuneo against Faenza's Astorre Manfredi. In October, commanding 150 cavalry, Braccio repelled Bernardo della Serra's larger force near the Reno River by constructing 3 pontoon bridges and defending trenches, earning knighthood on the occasion, and increased the salary as a condottiero, as well as the right to bear Cuneo's insignia. That is, this lords said, this condottiero is mine, it's my brand. And within the company led, however, to false accusations of plotting the same Barbiano's murder, forcing Andrea to flee after a warning from Barbiano's wife, right? Though Barbiano later invited him back, which Braccio sort of prudently refused. In 1405, Braccio's valor in a skirmish earned him command of 150 lances to aid the da Carrara in Padua against Venice. I made a video about medieval Padua, and we profusely talk, of course, about the Serenissima. This is despite slander from Lorenzo di Cotignola and Rosso dell'Aquila that, again, these were all competing condottieri, even when they were fighting side by side. When their refusal to obey, in fact, Braccio sparked a soldier revolt, Barbiano backed Braccio, securing a commission from Baldassarre Cossa in Bologna. We are in January 1406 to lead 300 horsemen. You see how he's rising through the ranks in this quite dynamic, pan-Italian scenario. By September 1405, facing poverty, Andrea sold his clothes to survive and briefly served Mostarda da Forlì in Rome after Pope Innocent VII's expulsion. In Viterbo, unable to pay his inn bill, an innkeeper gifted him 4 ducats and recommended him to his son in Bolsena. Years later, Andrea repaid this kindness by freeing the innkeeper from prison. This tells you how miserable, of course, life was, even for such a distinguished condottiero. And this constant move, right, is really typical of the meager life of errant knights. In general, we talked a bit about this in some general video about sort of the mercenary lifestyle in the late medieval, early modern age, and sort of fits generally well. The surplus could be more than living as, I don't know, as a peasant. It could also be, and would be butchered sometimes by these raging condottieri. But it was nevertheless dramatically intense, tiring, traumatic, and more. In 1406, leading 800 cavalry, by the way, mostly Perusian exiles, so with connection with his own land, Andrea raided the same Perusian countryside from Borgo San Sepolcro in the west, but he was repelled by Pietro da Bagno, Ceccolino Michelotti, and Paolo Orsini. In 1407, with Fabrizio da Perugia, he plundered Romagna and Tuscany, extorting small communes to sustain his company, which was kind of, typical. If you don't pay us, I'll plunder your countryside, and the communes will, make their mass in the pocket and see what was more convenient. In April, Braccio raided Citerna, San Giustino, and Pistrino with 600 cavalry and 500 infantry, where more than 1,000 men. But Orsini's 1,000 cavalry halted him, at least. In May, Rocca Contrada, today's Arcevia, offered him lordship to lift Ludovico Miglioratis' siege, who, as rector and lord of Fermo, here we are in the Marches, opposed the new rector, Benedetto Bishop of Montefeltro. With 1,000 cavalry and 4,000 infantry at this point. See, again, the progression is fascinating. Andrea captured Caldarola, Castiglione, and Montalto delle Marche, sparing the latter from sack. Facing Angelo della Pergola's 700 cavalry, he outmaneuvered them on a hill, repelling their attack with minimal losses, 15 of his men versus 12 of the enemy. as we will see now, Condottieri's warfare is actually way more bloody than this. Never believe what Machiavelli said. These battles were incredibly bloody, and if you know how also Braccio's career ended, I don't have anything to spoil. Now, Braccio's troops, including Spinta, with 105 wounds, by the way, and Guglielmo Lancelotti with 72 surviving. So, again, a lot of blows, a lot of them. Consider we are here in the moment in which basically plate armor is taking almost completely over the warriors' protection, especially of these leaders that spent there all the time, beating the hell out of each other with double-handed swords, war hammers, maces, etc. Braccio plundered 300 soldiers, raided Monte Giorgio, Monte Conero, the Conero Mountain, and Fano's castles, freeing prisoners for 7,000 ducats, and extorted 5,000 more from the town of Cingoli. Likely at the Davarano's urging, Braccio entered the Marca proper, securing his first territorial dominion. So at this point, he basically grafted his company into the province. In June and July, he joined Ladislas of Anjou Durazzo's service, sacking Ascoli in the Picenum with Migliorati on June the 10th. In August, supporting the papal vice-rector against Migliorati, he captured Belmonte, Monte San Pietrangeli, Sant'Elpidio a Mare, Monte Leone di Fermo, Monte Giberto, Montottone, Grotta Azzolina, San Giovanni. Do you understand how long remember, he's operating in the marches from his newly acquired base as probably a robust force, Mount Urano, defeating Migliorati himself at Monte Cosaro. He forced Malatesta's troops from Castel Raimondo to Fabriano, the latter, as you know, the European, at least Western European capital of paper making, ambushing 200 cavalry using a ruse with mares in heat. Sacked Apiro, rejecting its surrender, and besieging Antonio da San Severino. These are relatively famous condottieri. Withdrawing after payment. So he was getting a lot of harsh and ransom money. Right? Reportedly influenced by a vision of warrior saints as well. Again, we don't know really what kind of gigantic forces agitated within the minds of these condottieri and how, an Italian warlord from the beginning of the 15th century would metaphysically visualize a siege of a castle within these landscapes lost to our memory. Counts like Matelica, Macerata, and Monte Cassiano, paid him repeatedly, viewing his campaigns as protective even. So that's to say, this guy, if we pay this guy, he will leave us alone and also screen us from other hoax. At Monte Cassiano, a decree where in January the 29th, 1408, named Braccio a reformer of the province, of the Marca proper. What we'll have to make in our historical original series, wresting the title from the papal rector. So at this point he was in open clash with the papal government and essentially acting as a counter leader, so taking on also as a lord powers in the local justice administration. This is relevant because, of course, as we've seen, the cities also partially backed him and he needed to organize better their resources. Paving the ground for an increasing lordship. In December 1407, peace negotiations initiated by Conte da Carrara, this was the actual name, Count. These are how they reasoned, by the way. A Davarano and others culminated in a truce and a general peace ratified at Macerata's provincial parliament on February the 7th, 1408, stipulating salaries for Andrea and other Perusian captains. By the way, I would like to stress again on Conte Count, these names may sound, they always have, the etymologies are very interesting. Of course, it has to do with being a comes, right? So probably the title of the older war banners, like in Rome and the migration era. In April, Braccio moved to Umbria, settling near Todi to serve Ladislas' conquest of Rome, which surrendered on April the 23rd. We'll look at that phase in history. If you're interested, I made a video about the Angevin Kingdom of Naples that explains more or less what was going on. Also, the one about medieval Lazio talked about it, but we'll have to make specific videos on the entire situation. Perusian leaders, pressured by Braccio exile heavy army, offered Ladislas. So in other words, some of these guys actually oppose Braccio's heavy growing power. So considering that the Kingdom of Naples stretched up to the Abruzzi, so it was not that far away from Perugia as well. On June the 5th, Ladislas delegated Giacomo Galgani and Ceccolino Michelotti to take Perugia. So it's always the Michelotti in between against Braccio, signing terms with the Raspanti on June the 19th, deploying 6,000 cavalrymen against Andrea's forces in the area around Todi. This is a pretty large force, which tells you also how feared already Braccio was. Suspecting a plot, Andrea sent Guglielmo Lancellotti to confirm Ladislas' intentions, then declared himself his enemy, occupying Jesi in early June. This theater straddles Umbria and the Marches. In early June as compensation for unpaid papal stipends, because in part, again, here sides have been switched. Now the Pope has interest, of course, in going against the Neapolitans. So Ladislas responds on June 23rd, sending Migliorati, Martino da Faenza and Ceccolino Michelotti to devastate the same Jesi's countryside. However, Andrea's 1,500 cavalry held firm against them. In September, Braccio even defeated Giulio Cesare da Capua, so literally it was called Julius Caesar, and Pieretto de Andreas on the Promena river. In December, Migliorati defected to a league against Ladislas, including Florence, Bologna, under Cardinal Cossa and the Malatesta, though, generalized warfare persisted in the southern Marca. The Marca would be the March of Ancona, by the way. So roughly the marches. In April 1409, Ladislas attacked Tuscany, targeting Siena, supported by Florence here, which you can see it, in fact, also in the video that videos made about medieval Siena. Florence at this point hires Braccio with 400 lances. From July the 3rd, based in Città di Castello, Braccio protected Arezzo, Tuscan city, with Malatesta, because Arezzo was under Florence at this point, fortifying nearby castles and harassing Neapolitan camps, in the process of repelling an attack on Castiglione Fiorentino, which was a fortress that Florence had historically erected just at a pretty strategic presence in the area. We're in June 1409. In defeating again, Giulio Cesare da Capua at Umbertide in September, capturing 50 cavalry. Some places also recur as battlefields. Appointed commander-in-chief of Florentine troops, Braccio entered Rome's Borgo San Pietro with Paolo Orsini on October the 1st, former enemy, bear in mind, besieging the same Castel Sant'Angelo, which fell to the Pope in this way, because here Florence was aligned with the Papacy on October the 2nd. Though the city at large resisted, Rome was entirely fortified. You have very few people have an idea what medieval Rome actually was, because the Renaissance, the Baroque, sort of canceled that vision. Even more the later modern contemporary architecture, but in general, probably the historical center, you can still see it in some places, was radically fortified. Look at the size of militias towers, right? Just next to enormous Roman monuments, but showing how medieval civilization was definitely not inferior to that magnificence. Wintering near Todi, Braccio was absent when the Romans admitted Malatesta and Orsini on January the 2nd. We're in 1410 now. Perugia, protected by Ladislas, by the way, hired Angelo Broglio da Lavello, the Tartaglia, so this was a nickname. Andrea raided Chiusi, capturing 80 prisoners, 5,000 cattle, 1,000 horses, and 10,000 smaller livestock, escaping Ceccolino Michelotti near Lake Trasimeno by mixing infantry with dismounted cavalry. Right, always trying to go back to Perugia. In April, Braccio scaled Torgiano's walls at night in a coup, seizing Castelleone, Calonica, Rucellesco, Quadri, and Titignano in the following weeks. On May the 17th, Baldassare Cossa became Pope John the 23rd. Yes, because even though this is an anti-pope, right? So John the 23rd is in the 20th century, but the enumeration at the time he boasted was the other one. He was of the peace and obedience, and at this point, likely Braccio was visiting Bologna. In June, Braccio attacked Tiber Bridge Fort in Rome with wheeled wooden towers, routing Ladislas' forces at Sora, which he sacked. In August, Florence paid him 14,000 florins. In September, Spoleto granted him and his allies citizenship and hired him for raids on Terni, where he burned the Porta Spoletina, so the gate from beside the Spoleto, and stole church bells, which were a great symbol of communal identity, and so an enormous affront. This is interesting because I made a video about the Duchy of Spoleto, if you're interested, not much about Spoleto itself, but this is yet another Umbrian city that basically adopts, as you can see here politically, the Bracceschi that are, again, gravitating closer to Perugia ever again. In November, possibly on the night of the 13th, Braccio and Orsini attacked, in fact, the same Perugia via San Pietro's monastery, but were repelled by the Tartaglia from Marciano, losing over 100 men. Right, that will be actually also the monastery where the same Braccio will be later buried. As you understand from casualties, there are brutal engagements. I mean, some of these men would be captured, etc., but the dead are also there. In January 1411, Andrea renewed his condotta with Louis of Anjou. So this after an important defeat. Louis of Anjou, that was at this point allied with the anti-pope and Florence. So that's, as we've seen in part, the new asset against Ladislas as well. Entering Rome with Luigi and assailing Civitavecchia, held by the Tartaglia and Vicus prefect for Ladislas. When, again, we should talk about the Neapolitan civil wars here to be a bit more complete. But in any case, when Neapolitan reinforcements at this point arrived by sea, he had to withdraw to Todi, then Torgiano, where a fierce 3-hour battle on May 10th strengthened his blockade on Perugia. It was a success. His presence at the Battle of Roccasecca on May 19th, where he and Sforza defeated Ladislas, is debated, though many consider it a major victory, capturing 600 cavalry. There are, again, these condottieri battles in which everybody namely had to be present. As we've seen, it's a bit difficult to actually physically trace for the 14th century, the 15th century, where these men actually were. And we actually have the name for lots of these condottieri, most of which were presumably there. We also made just a few, I think just a couple, in fact, of condottieri era battle videos, which were Molinella and Caravaggio, but we shall also, in fact, continue in this direction. That summer, Braccio intensified operations in Umbria, capturing Ponte Pattoli, Monte Melino, Santa Giuliana, San Gismondo de Ruta, Ponte Nuovo, Castiglione of the Lake, Monticelli, and more castles. In November, he reached Camerino. during a revolt against Rudolf III's sons, mediating to support the Davarano there. These are still the marches. Again, Braccio mostly operates, as you've seen, in central Italy. Umbria, the Abruzzi also recently started the chapter in the original series on Abruzzo. The marches, the area of Rome, partially in Tuscany. So it's very, very Central European condottiero. In February-March 1412, Braccio seized Marciano, Cerqueto, Gualdo Cattaneo, selling the latter to Niccolò Trinci for 4,000 ducats and attempting to take his Montone. In April, he besieged Perugia even, but was defeated by Ceccolino Michelotti. In May, Ancona hired him against Martino da Faenza, and he captured Apira from Antonio da San Severino. Peace talks with John XXIII and Ladislas concluded at San Felice on June 17, 1412. On June 29, he met Paolo Orsini and Cardinal Oddone Colonna in Rome as a consequence. The peace made Ladislas, by the way, gonfalonier of the church, ceding Perugia to him for 10 years, with Andrea required to yield nearby castles for 24,000 florins. In early February 1413, he marched to Bologna to reassert papal authority, defeating Malatesta and Manfredi forces on the Canale River, and Micheletto Attendolo near Imola, capturing 400 Sforza cavalry. In March, enemies seized his Umbrian castles, except Marciano and Ponte Pattoli, that he had maintained and occupied. In April, he recaptured Montone, though, and in May, he relieved Orsini in Arcevia, defeating Angevin forces from the south. In July and August, he clashed with Ceccolino Michelotti at Ponte Pattoli, reoccupying Prodo and Titignano, and routed Antonio da Napoli from Naples, and Gualdo Cattaneo, capturing Obizzo da Carrara at Col di Pepo. Facing plague, by the way, Braccio retreated to Frattucciola Selvatica, which sounds pretty entrenched place, which means basically like small sort of forest fraction of some sort, to escape the plague, in fact, avoiding bigger centers. But later, he was yet again active, routing Neapolitan forces at Todi. In 1414, Braccio repelled Orsini's attack on the same Todi, devastated Cocco Salimbeni's land, extorting 30,000 ducats, a freaking lot of money, to consider also how powerful this would make him in many ways, and in fact became the same governor of Bologna, by the way, there narrowly escaping John XXIII's plot to kill him, because he was really becoming too powerful by all means. In August, Braccio acquired Medicina, and on October 28, he and Giovanni received Montone as a county. This is his brother. And so they were technically enfeoffed in their own ancestral allodium. After John XXIII's departure for Constance, this is the age of councils, I made a video last spring about this, where on October the 1st, Braccio's power in Romagna grew. In 1415, Braccio raided Forlì, Ravenna, and Cesena, capturing livestock and extorting tributes, repelling Pandolfo Malatesta's attack in the Rimini area and burning Cesenatico's port. In January 1416, he suppressed a Bolognese revolt, securing 82,000 ducats for ceding castles like San Pietro, Castel Bolognese, Medicina, and Pieve di Cento for 96,000 florins. In April 1416, Andrea shifted to Umbria once again, capturing castles through Perusian noble exiles and attempting an unsuccessful assault on the city itself. He accepted Todi's lordship on June the 12th, Orvietus on June the 14th, and Corcianos on October the 28th. On July the 12th, at Colle della Strada and San Giglio, that would be today's Sant'Angelo, he decisively defeated Carlo Malatesta, Angelo della Pergola, Ceccolino Michelotti, his arch rival, and Paolo Orsini, that, as we've seen now, recurs both together and against him, capturing many, including the same Malatesta, with his own son Otto, because of course these condottieri traveled with their own courts and families in part. Otto had been born on February 15, 1410, in Città di Castello, and pupil, in arms, Niccolò Piccinino, that distinguished himself. Piccinino would become one of famous. We've seen him also in other battles, in Caravaggio, etc. But it's, again, you can't understand under which whose in particular school had been. On July the 16th, at Montemarcino's Olivetan convent, 8 ambassadors offered Braccio Perugia's lordship, which he accepted. This was a great achievement and the crowning of a lifetime spent trying to obtain it. On July the 18th, an assembly of over 400 citizens of Perugia granted Braccio full dominion with absolute authority, reinstating exiled nobles and restoring their confiscated properties. Braccio pledged to uphold statutes, appoint the podestà and treasurer, and avoid new taxes or recruitment without consent, entering Perugia on July the 19th, retaining most elected priors, but adding 2 of his choice, then leaving days later for further exploit. Despite returning after a long exile, in fact, he prioritized his mercenary army, avoiding reliance on Perugia for security. After all, he was at the head of some of the finest troops in the peninsula. The Perusian communal army was good at this point, and the Italian art of war is best to defend its city gates. We don't have to underestimate them, but the crisis of the previous generation, with the Black Death and everything, had really hit hard the European communes. Andrea's ambitions drove him to expand in the Marca once again, which was relatively sheltered from greater powers, disrupted also by his defeat of the Malatesta, and also toward Rome under Cardinal Giacomo Isolani during the papal vacancy. Paolo Orsini's murder on August 5th, 1446, removed yet another rival. Andrea sent the Tartaglia against Orsini lands and operated in the Marca, forming an anti-Malatesta league with Migliorati and the Davarano since March 1416, nominally supporting the church, but de facto wielding a quite personal power. When the Malatesta refused a 100,000 florin ransom for Carlo Malatesta, held by Berardo Davarano, Braccio, named church defender, conquered San Severino, Pesaro, Osimo, and much of the Fano Ascoli territory between August and September, with Macerata joining the league. Uprisings in Umbria, including Orvieto's Orsini-backed revolt and Perugia's tensions, prompted, however, Braccio to return back home. He permitted the Michelotti's expulsion on September the 3rd, but opposed exiling populists, fearing, in fact, a rebellion from different forces involved. In November, possibly in Perugia, he received Venetian ambassadors, including Andrea Contarini, demanding Malatesta's release. Naturally, as I was saying before, we don't have the time to browse all the policies of the various communes here. Obviously enough, all these powers were, as we've seen here, linked, interconnected all across the peninsula. They all had their own interest for backing this or that actor. Peace talks mediated by Guido Antonio da Montefeltro from January the 26th to February the 2nd, 1417, concluded on March the 22nd with Malatesta freed on April the 11th for 80,000 florins. From March to May 1417, Andrea prepared a Roman campaign, reconciling Todi's factions and subduing Terni, which had initially resisted him. On June the 9th, he met Cardinal Isolani near Rome, and on June the 12th, Cardinal Pietro Stefaneschi, relying his demands for governorship, city gate control, senator selection, and revenue access to the urbs. Rome's grain shortage forced Isolani's acquiescence, in fact, and Andrea thus entered the Appian Gate on June the 16th, staying on the Aventine Hill, occupying the Papal Palace, and besieging the St. Castel Sant'Angelo from July the 8th. Joanna of Naples sent Sforza, who encamped at St. John's Gate on August the 10th. An epidemic, likely among his own troops, forced Braccio to abandon Rome via the Milvian Bridge on August the 26th, retreating to Narni in Umbria until at least September the 20th, when he resumed operations, in Umbria, and the Mark collecting tributes and raiding Spoleto, Norcia, and Rome, herself proclaiming himself the urb's protector, however, essentially enforcing his own lordship. Braccio was senator of Rome, which during the Middle Ages meant de facto sort of governatorate, as probably a communal representative of the city. Pope Martin V's election on November the 11th, 1417, alarmed Braccio. And he was right, because Martin V, as you know, will basically bring back papal power in Rome big time. And this prompted the intensification of Braccio's control over Todi in the mid of January 1418, Perugia, and Jesi throughout all basically January, February. Perugia's councils sought a vicariate from Constance, but Martin V, citing Braccio's Roman occupation, issued a specific excommunication of the condottiero, therefore rejecting him entirely in his papal scheme. On March the 2nd, Andrea decreed that exiles' wives lost dowry rights during their husbands' lifetimes, which was very interesting, because especially many noble women had pretty consistent dowries that could now be seized by public authority. That month, so it's also a desperate way to cash fast to pay his troops. That month, his son Aldo married Elisabetta Trinci of Foligno after an agreement, at least it was negotiated engagement, in 1417. After April the 13th, 1418, Braccio moved to the Mark, reasserting control over San Severino, Mogliano, Loro, and Falerone, extorting payments, and in late May took Castel della Pieve and subdued Ulisse Orsini of Mugnano. In June, he extorted 35,000 florins from Lucas Paolo Guinici to spare his domains and sacked Fermo's lands. In August, he seized Pergola and extracted 14,000 ducats from Norcia. It's also incredible how rich these communes were amidst all these turbulences, to have tens of thousands of florins to simply be paid to basically keep out these condottieri. By September, Braccio withdrew to Jesi, by the way, due to plague. Facing papal opposition, he captured Cetona and retook Sassoferrato. Remember, he was operating within the papal states, and now the current pontiff is against him. He operates on the Adriatic watershed, so of course there is a pretty substantial difficulty from Rome, if not through different condottieri, to send in that part of the peninsula to block, to at least contain Braccio. In 1419, Braccio sought papal favor to restore some sort of normalcy, but also attacked Gubbio on March the 6th and took Assisi after a brutal sack, suffering a foot wound. So he was a bit desperate. He was trying to balance out his needs with some sort of reappeasement with hope. In June, he defeated the Sforza near Viterbo, capturing 2,300 cavalry, and killed Ciccolino and Guido de Michelotti. This was a great victory. Even more so because scored in the north of Rome. It was a pretty heavy, as you understand, time and circumstance. Florence on September the 29th sent envoys to Martin V, who appointed Guido Antonio da Montefeltro rector of Spoleto on January the 7th, Joanna II of Naples to send sforza against Braccio. At Spoleto on April the 9th, Andrea and the Tartaglia defeated Sforza's troops, however, who fled to Viterbo. You understand how many powerful sovereigns were trying to take Braccio down, and from his Umbrian and Marquesan possessions, he was successfully thwarting all these attempts. A truce with Montefeltro followed. These were, again, top-notch condottieri, by the way. But Martin V forced its cancellation and lured the Tartaglia with Toscanella's county and 300 lances. Braccio, backed by the Trinci and the d'Avarano, kept adversaries divided. Florence's mediation achieved peace on February 26, 1420, obliging Andrea to recover Bologna for the Pope. Florence did not especially like the connections with Naples cut for her economy. So here, basically, the papacy is trying to co-opt Braccio to a degree. Having him maintain 300 lances in the Mark for 3 years and 500 cavalry contingent in the south of Rome, in the Campagna and Marittima, for 2 months to stabilize the situation and return papal territories, however, in the process as well, which was a bit more complicated. Martin V, however, assessed sort of Braccio's partial agreement and lifted his excommunication for encouragement, paid his army, and granted vicariates over those lands and polities that could not quite be lost. So he basically enfeoffed Braccio over Perugia, so basically the Umbria as a whole, by importance almost, Assisi, Castel della Pieve, Cesi, Terra Arnolfa's castles, Cannara, Gualdo Tadino. By the way, the term Gualdo has a German Longobarд origin. Perhaps I just made a video about the Longobard frontiers, especially in the Apennines at some point, that bordered toponymy. Spello, Staphyle, Todi without castles. However, it's extremely complicated. At some point, we'll make some better video explaining the government, the papal government. This is after Albornoz, an attempt at sort of political uniformation of the papal states that were quite sort of just after the popes had come back from Avignon. Montalbotto, Iesi, and Rocca Contrada. So it's a big deal of territories, right? And Braccio is thus recognized as their ruler by the same pope. Peace with Montefeltro was signed on March the 14th and celebrated in Perugia on March the 28th, with Roberto di Pandolfo Malatesta betrothed to Braccio's illegitimate daughter, Innamorata, also known as Carlotta, who married Galeotto Roberto Malatesta in 1423. This was important. Condottieri, especially some of them, were not particularly fussy. Also, illegitimate daughters were fine, given in this case the prestige of their father. Braccio's other illegitimate daughter, Lucrezia, married Bastiano Cappone. In Perugia, Andrea initiated public works, at this point probably as a full ruler, governor in a relatively peaceful moment. The San Lorenzo Piazza Loggia, that you can see also in the pictures recurring in Perugia, the Sopramuro Piazza Vaults, San Francesco's church restoration, city wall repairs, and even a Trasimeno Lake drainage gallery. Braccio's coat of arms featured a black ram on a gold shield, as you can see in the thumbnail, topped by a leopard. In May 1420, with 2,000 cavalry and foot soldiers, Braccio marched on Bologna with Migliorati, Della Pergola, and Ferrara's marquis, seizing communes and raiding the countryside. On July the 16th, at Borgo Panicale, Antonio Galeazzo Bentivoglio, yet another famous Romagnol house, agreed with Braccio and Cardinal Condolmer, who took Bologna for the Pope on July the 21st. Widowed, Braccio married Nicolina da Varano in December at Santa Maria degli Angeli with lavish festivities despite her mourning attire, because she had also been recently widowed. In October 1420, Joanna II, losing Martin the Fifth and Sforza's support, negotiated from Naples with Braccio via Alfonso of Aragon, that was already essentially looming over also southern Italy from the Catalan sea power, concluding terms by January the 15th, 1421. Braccio entered the Abruzzi then, capturing Teramo and other centers, reaching Naples on July the 8th. Basically, he had smelled that she was weak, and she was also notoriously, we've explained in the video about Angevin Naples, essentially opening the gates to the Aragonese in order to protect her. On July the 20th, Joanna named, in fact, Alfonso of Aragon her heir and vicar, and appointed, however, the same Braccio as Great Constable to keep him good. Like, his lieutenants in Umbria harassed church territories in the meanwhile, which was, generally speaking, predictable. So at this point, Martin V sent the Tartaglia to aid Sforza. In September 1421, Braccio's legitimate son Carlo was born, for whom a marriage contract with Anna Colonna, so the daughter, one of the greatest Roman noble baronial houses, was arranged in 1423. However, this was never fulfilled. Between late 1421 and early 1422, Alfonso of Aragon named Braccio governor of both the Abruzzi area, the Citerior and Ulterior. We will talk more about Abruzzi and how and why it had been sort of administered that, these repartitions. In June 1422, Braccio returned to Umbria again via the Marca and the Abruzzi. So he made lots of back and forth across this scenery of his that spanned, as we've seen here, substantially wide latitudinally, particular territory under the Adriatic, possibly passing Caravallo di Fiastra's Abbey, though its alleged sack is doubtful. There will be lots of black legions about Braccio. We'll see better later. On July the 7th, Braccio besieged Città di Castello, capturing it on September the 3rd. This was a very important city in Umbria. Historically, the Perusians, we've seen it in the relative video, had hotly contested this also with the Aretines and more. At this point, Braccio also joins a Florence-Siena-Lucca League, with a 30,000 florin annual contract, which was a hell of a stipend. This Tuscan communes wanted this central Italian area to be further stabilized, and or to have Braccio from their side at least, amidst different rivalries. In January 1423, Joanna and Alfonso granted Braccio the Principality of Capua, as well formalized on February the 14th in Perugia, along with the County of Foggia, so some Campanian and Apulian territories that Braccio's power was irradiating into, so mostly in the north. Foggia was historically not quite as Canusia, but right around the key of the Apulian plateau, right? Of the Tavoliere, and Capua was incredibly rich, fertile countryside, right? We have to talk more about southern Italy. We rarely do it, if anything. Preparing a Naples campaign opposed by Florence, Braccio entered the Contado of L'Aquila, famous cornerstone of the Abruzzo's interland, created as the eagle, literally, the Aquila by Frederick II to properly shield the Neapolitan kingdom's northern frontier. This area in the Abruzzi was namely under the Kingdom of Naples, but it was historically incredibly decentralized, and we'll explain better. It made some videos, if anything, about Neapolitan administration at a point. It was very, again, autonomous. These monarchies also across the entire about the times they were controlled, mostly just certain strategic parts of, especially the coast, the most fertile land. But there were, especially in southern Italy, lots of powerful oligarchs that fundamentally were ever more entrenched in their own local privileges. In this ravages, again, there are this Posta, Sant'Angelo, Bourbon, and Pizzoli's castle captured in the... These are heavily mountainous terrain, by the way, and we can argue that Braccio had some experience being native from the Apennine. A battle on May the 12th, however, subdue L'Aquila. It would have been really a great prize for Braccio. Despite Alfonso's rift with Joanna, who revoked his adoption on July the 1st, Angevin Aragonese problems, Andrea maintained his titles in southern Italy, at least, even in spite, again, of his aggression to the Neapolitan kingdom. Alfonso's departure on October the 15th and Sforza's death on January the 3rd, 1424, did not sway him, and he wintered in Chieti, in Abruzzo. On February the 14th, Florence named him war captain for 60,000 florins. A failed assault on L'Aquila, once again on February the 27th, led to secret talks via Corrado Trinci. A league of Joanna of Naples, Martin V, and Filippo Maria Visconti of Milan was formed. At this point, we are on March 28th. And on June the 2nd, 1424, the fateful day occurred. Because finally, Braccio's enemies had his best. Andrea's army was defeated near L'Aquila at the anonymous battle at the plain of Bazzano. Abruzzo has interesting battle theaters, including Tagliacozzo. I made an entire video on, right? Andrea was defeated by at least the command of Jacopo Caldora's forces. That was a skilled former pupil of his, wounded in the head and neck by a mace blow. Braccio was captured and died 3 days later, June the 5th, possibly from a throat or cranial injury, exacerbated. Apparently, there are, again, different legends about this, but let's say possibly Francesco Sforza's interference during surgery, because naturally the guy was better kept alive to a degree, or in fact, as other accounts suggest, killed by Caldora in violent rage, perhaps by Andrea Castelli for revenge, or by refusing food and medicine in captivity himself. I mean, he really wanted to die at that point, either because he thought he would have not survived anyway, or because... Do you understand what we've just read? The life of a condottiero. His Aquilan defeat stemmed from a flawed strategy, exposed troops, unused infantry. Here, we're not there just to simply judge. We'll talk about the Battle of L'Aquila in 1424. Some say misplaced forces, again, under Niccolò Piccinino, was present defections by Giampaolo Ursini, Antonio Cantelmo, reluctant captains. This could have all been true and still not perhaps decided the thing altogether. There were also determined Perugian allies led by Lodovico Michelotti that, as we've seen, recur as this constant, former enemies had passed under his command, but they were just waiting for some weakness to exploit the situation, to get back what was theirs in their view. At the moment of his death, Braccio was excommunicated, so his body was buried in unconsecrated ground by Martin V's own order. In 1432, his nephew, Niccolò Fortebraccio, moved his remains to Perugia's San Francesco al Prato church, accompanied by a cortege with a velvet-draped coffin in 50 veiled nights amidst a hailstorm that allegedly destroyed Roman crops. This is incredibly fascinating, kind of dark and beautiful in many ways. A 2013 exhumation confirmed a skull wound, described as, quote, not high but well placed. Andrea's character was complex, striking in appearance, impaired in his left side, as we've seen from an early age. And so imagine even performing what he did here with these menomations from early engagements, with a charming manner apparently, yet at least reputedly cruel. There were lots of people who wanted him dead. Consequently, there are lots of stories also fabricated by later Renaissance chronicles. You know, every author had, from different cities, had their own legends and stories and opinions, and so this can't be too reliable. But just for the sake of color, Braccio was reportedly laughing while ordering tortures, such as throwing victims from towers in Spoleto and Assisi, submerging a prisoner in Viterbo's Pelacano Spring, which may have well been possible in general for different reasons, punishing monks, including crushing the testicles of 18 at a Franciscan convent and throwing 6 from a bell tower for their singing. Described for this reason as impious, at least by his opponents, and so as an enemy of the papacy rather than of the church, and allegedly absent from Mass for 30 years, he was deemed unworthy of religious rites. Yet his military genius and loyalty to employers were undeniable, at least. He was one of the greatest condottieri in Italian history. And again, a proud Umbrian and at the end of the day, Papal States warlord. His campaigns nearly forged a central Italian state, if you think about it, in different parts of the same. Witnessing to what we were talking about before, had there been a greater sort of will, which did not exist at the time, to unite this land. It's not like there wasn't an attempt by single autocrats, like in this case, but it would have probably been one of the greatest, if not the greatest, power in Italy. Braccio earned, as we've seen, titles such as Prince of Capua, Count of Foggia, and Count of Montone, his ancestral, as we've seen, land, Lord of Arcevia, Assisi, Bologna, Cannara, Castel Bolognese. The list is long. Castel San Pietro Terme, Cingoli, Città della Pieve, Città di Castello, Gualdo Cattaneo, Gualdo Tadino, Iesi, Medicina, Montecassiano, Narni, Nocera Umbra, Orte, Orvieto, Ostra Vetere, Perugia, say, of course, Pieve di Cento, Rieti, San Gemini, Sassoferrato, Spello, Spoleto, Teramo, Terni, and Todi. This is altogether a strikingly large amount of also fairly well-entrenched places that, as we've seen, were incredibly austic to properly assault, penetrate. I mean, he, as an insider, could skillfully take this one by one in a lifetime, but his enemies had much greater issues at that. Captain General of the Church, Grand Constable of Naples, and Senator of Rome, right? All titles obtained, as we've seen, from polities that were even not really siding for him, but were obliged to bestow him with such offices due to his pressing threat. His Braccesca school emphasized rapid maneuvers, leaving a legacy of tactical brilliance. Urban improvements, by the way, in Perugia and Todi, still the places we visit, and you can inform yourself. There are very sort of specific things connected with Braccio, as well as artworks. As I was saying at the beginning of the video, we do not see here the wall taste, but the condottieri were lords of culture, as I titled them in one of my videos from last year. And so, despite Braccio's vices, that apparently led to his downfall, and he died in his 50s, but it was a very intense life lived in arms. One can't but realize the greatness, in fact, of this man. and appreciating, in fact, the complexity also of this specific phase, straddling the 14th to 15th century, especially in central Italy, that sometimes people don't even, the most basic thing is, there is a northern and a southern Italy. Central Italy is very specific, is very characteristic, is very on its own. There are three parts of Italy, really, and that in fact have barely to do with one another, at least in their own specificity. It's not a made-up thing. It's really a sort of specifically ethnocultural one, regardless of also the further divisions. But still, as we've seen with the de facto homogeneous practice of these condottieri, not just militarily, but obviously politically and also socially, artistically, as patrons, as again, as men of culture at some point as well. In many cases, as a matter of fact, we'll see it better with other names. They really marked a very important time in Italian history, and they incarnated some of the highest levels of, knighthood, men-at-arms, say, properly martial culture, in also a pretty harsh moment in European history, because, again, people have this general, not necessarily idea of segmentation of centuries in their warfare, but if you go on the internet, like this self-citizen, so to say, experts in medieval warfare still sticking to some almost atemporal and or kind of deterministic or superficial idea of how medieval armies evolved or whatever. It's a fairly specific thing, even in the backdrop of a sort of general similarity at some points in some things. But the most important aspect is realizing that if you don't pass through these very stories, you can't even properly appreciate what this is all about, right? Talking about battles in particular is of incredible importance. We will have to keep doing it more often, but perhaps even diluting for the content with these intros is fascinating, because it tells you what people could do or would do, right? Imagine how many videos are there on the Battle of Azincourt, but how many are there on, say, Henry V for example, from a military standpoint in general in his life. In fact, I really want to make an equivalent of this video for Henry V of England that we have also horrendously never talked about. But it's really bad, and we really have to make up for it. I really want to make much more on English history, because it seems to me in many ways that there is an enormous, let's say, precedence in historical interest for essentially just like the bigger system. And when we look at specific leaders and how or why they fought and died and so on, it's sometimes more, the reasons become more obscure, and or people say, oh, okay, it depended also on single people. Yeah, of course it did. And all of these are significantly intertwined. Sometimes we have to rush because the information on these leaders is also pretty dense. So the way to present it may be overwhelming at a time. And I was glad to talk about Braccio, because also about the condottieri here, I see that we haven't made too much or so much. Like we have made lots of videos about the single Italian communities, but I think including the later medieval period, which is very important, that we've seen, in fact, very part of these mechanisms at a bigger picture. But in general, we haven't really covered, especially the single leaders' figures. We shouldn't even overly exceed with that, telling the truth. But it's always a good place to start from. So I'm really glad that, if anything, we covered Braccio da Montone, because he definitely had something to say, definitely as a ruler, as a leader as well. and as such we should perhaps be a bit more appreciative, more interested, right? And that's something we're attempting to do with these videos. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.